Numbers chapters 11 and 12 tonight. And as you can see, if you've got a paper, we're going to be reading about several instances in which some complaining and murmuring took place, and the judgment of God upon those who did the complaining. And so question number one kind of sets the stage for what we're studying tonight. The question is, what makes it difficult to be around people who complain a lot? You know, I was kind of thinking about the idea, and maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm a little pessimistic about it, but would you say that we live in a complaining society? I'd say most people who deal with the public probably would say yes, right? And why do you think that's the case? Why do you think there's so much complaining? Yeah. Is it because, you know, we're lacking a lot of blessings in our society? A lot of good things just don't happen. You know, nothing positive. So why would people complain a lot?
They're not appreciating from God.
Okay. Generally speaking, you know, people who complain a lot, I guess we could say, I don't know that they forget the good that happens to them. Maybe they just ignore. Maybe they just ignore all the good things that happen to them. Somebody else? Yes, the squeaky wheel does usually get the grease. That is a true saying. But you know, if you're around somebody who's always complaining, basically they're always, you know, they have a negative outlook on life, don't they? They have a negative outlook on the things that happen to them on a day-by-day basis. And so they're never really happy. You know, I don't think there's ever a point in their life where they're completely satisfied. And why is that difficult to be around? It does, doesn't it? It has a tendency, and that's one of the lessons I think we'll see in our two chapters tonight. It has a tendency to have a negative effect on those around it. And so, no, I don't think anybody, is there anybody here tonight who likes a complainer?
My mom always used to say misery loves company.
It does, it seems to, doesn't it? But I think what we're going to see from studying tonight is, does God like complainers? You know, is that something that He enjoys listening to? People who can't see the good in life or appreciate the good things that happen to them. All they can do is dwell on the negative. You know, we live in a age of negativity, and I think what we have to seems like there's always somebody or some group that's complaining about something that's happening within our society. But what we have to understand is we're in control, right? Do we have to complain? Do we have to choose to ignore the good things that happen to us on a daily basis? No, ultimately, we're responsible for ourselves. And so ultimately, you know, if we are a complainer, the only person we can really blame is ourselves. So let's go over to Numbers chapter 11, and I'll read the first 3 verses for us here, and then we'll talk a little bit, answer some of these questions. It says, "Now when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, for the Lord heard it, and His anger was aroused. So the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some in the outskirts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and when Moses prayed to the Lord, the fire was quenched. So he called the name of the place Taberah, because the fire of the Lord had burned among them." So question number 2 here on our handout is, what was it that the Israelites were complaining about here?
Almost there.
Okay.
We can see it in that verse. At some point they complained about the food they left in Egypt. They just didn't have the niceties.
Yeah, later on, they're going to certainly complain about the food, like Adam said, but it really doesn't identify, you know, specifically what they were complaining about. Now, kind of think back at the context. You know, we're studying this. A lot of times we pick up in these chapters, we don't really appreciate the context of them. But the children of Israel had just begun marching toward the promised land. Remember, God established all the order And they're only 3 days into their journey. And here you are, you're 3 days into your journey to the promised land, and already people are starting to gripe and complain about, I don't know specifically, but I would have probably assumed, I would assume that it was a little bit harder than what they expected it to be. It probably wasn't going as smoothly as they thought it should have gone. And think about, they've been camped there at Mount Sinai for about 11 months. And so they hadn't really marched as a group for quite a while. And probably they'd forgotten some of the burdens that would come along with that. So here they are, they're 3 days into this march. Probably the hardships that they were facing were worse than what they thought. And so they start complaining about this journey that they're taking. So what happens whenever the people start complaining? Number 3 here. What does Moses do? Well, first, what does God do? Let's start there. Yeah, God sent fire in the outskirts of the camp. And, some people have surmised that's where the complaining was coming from, and that's a pretty good supposition, I would think. But if you read about who was generally in the outskirts of the camp, do you remember? Well, it's going to be the same people that we begin reading about here in verse 4 and all, and that is this mixed multitude. You remember that when the children of Israel came up out of Egypt, and I know a lot of times we probably think, well, it was just all the Israelites that came. But evidently there were some Egyptians that came along with them. And they probably witnessed these miracles, seen what God had done, and joined in with the crowd. Obviously, they would have intermarried probably with some of these people. And so it was probably from this group of people that's pretty famous for murmuring throughout the scriptures that this complaining would have come from. And so God sends this fire among them, and what does Moses do for them?
Pray to God.
Yeah, he prays for them. And one thing about Moses, you can say what you want about Moses, but Moses cared about these people, didn't he? I mean, he was a sympathetic leader. And it seems like Moses is always interceding for these people. He's always standing between them and God. We know on one occasion, he offered to have his own name blotted out of the book of life so that they could continue on. And so he certainly did care for these people. He didn't want to see anybody destroyed. And so he intercedes in prayer for them. The second complaint, let's go ahead and read verses 4 through 9. We're not going to be able to read all these, but we'll just kind of read as time permits us. Somebody read chapter 11, verses 4 through 9 for us.
And the mixed multitude was among them fell and lusted. And the children of Israel also wept again and said, Who shall give us flesh to eat? We remember the fish which we did eat in Egypt, freely the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. But now our soul is dried away. There is nothing at all beside this manna before our eyes. And the manna was a coriander seed, and the color thereof as the color of bedlam. And the people went about and gathered it and ground it in the mills, or beat it in a mortar, and baked it in pans, and made cakes of it, and tasted it. And the taste of it was as the taste of fresh oil. And when the dew fell upon the camp in the night, the manna fell upon it. Then Moses heard the people weep throughout their families, every man in the door of his tent, and the anger of the Lord was kindled greatly. Moses also was displeased. And Moses said unto the Lord, Wherefore hast thou afflicted thy servant? And wherefore have I not found favor in thy sight, that thou may layest the burden of all this people upon me? How much was that?
You want to go ahead? Go through 15 while you're on the roll here.
Okay. Have I conceived all this people? Have I begotten them, that thou shouldest say unto me, Carry them in thy bosom, as a nursing father beareth the suckling child, unto the land which thou sworest unto their fathers? When should I have flesh to give unto all this people?
Okay, so the first complaint that the children of Israel launched, it really didn't specify exactly what they were complaining about, but the second one did. What was that second complaint? Yeah, the food. And was it the complaint that they didn't have any food? Was that what they were complaining about?
Didn't have the kind they were used to.
They didn't have the kind they wanted, right? God provided for the children of Israel. And of course, the way, as we read there, the way that he did that in the wilderness was through manna. Every day God would give them this heavenly bread to sustain them. There wasn't a lot of food that you could gather with your hands out there in the wilderness. And so God had continually provided for them. We do read, whenever they came up out of Egypt, there was one time where God did provide quail before this instance that we're going to read about. And of course, he did that out of his own kindness. But it kind of brings up the point. It wasn't that they didn't have any food; they just weren't appreciative of the food they had. And one of the things that I guess we probably all learned a lot through this pandemic that we've been through. But one of the things that I didn't appreciate was that I could go to the store and get whatever I wanted. If I wanted something to eat, I had something on my mind. I said, I can just go down there and get it. And you couldn't do that sometimes. Sometimes when you went during the COVID, and even a little bit now, sometimes everything was sold out. And in my mind, I was almost mad. I was like, I can't get what I want anymore. But that was the attitude of the children of Israel, wasn't it? We can't have what we want. We want this to eat. We want that to eat. And so all we have is this manna that God has given to us. And so they long for the food of slavery. Now, they talked about how good the food was in Egypt, and I would imagine there was more of a variety in Egypt, but how good do you think it tasted when you were in slavery? Think that was good food? I doubt it was as good as what they were remembering back in Egypt here. And so obviously, God is not pleased at all when he hears this murmuring and complaint. And so how does Moses respond whenever he hears the Israelites come to him? What does he do? Yeah, he does, doesn't he? And Moses is, a lot like God here in this instance, because we read back, what verse was it? Well, we read back in verse 1 that the anger of God is aroused whenever he hears everything that's going on. And then in verse 10, Moses hears the people weeping throughout their family. Everybody's out here and everybody's, pouting and crying, oh, we had this good food back in Egypt. And it says that the anger of the Lord was greatly aroused, but Moses was also displeased, wasn't he? Moses didn't share the same sentiment that these people had. And so I think what we have to understand about Moses is Moses understood, he was appreciative of what God had given him. He understood the value of it, and he wasn't in the same boat that a lot of these people were. But here you have all these people, and they're griping and they're complaining. And where do you go with a complaint? Well, you go to the top, don't you? You go to the leader. And so Moses was the one who had to listen, and he had to be the one, to try to figure out, well, what can we do, or what can I do to try to help these people? And so, like Adam said, he does complain a little bit here, but I can understand. He's got a legitimate, argument. He's saying, what can I do? Here we are, we're out here in the middle of the wilderness, and they're wanting something other than manna to eat. I can't provide anything for them. I can't give them anything. And so I think he's kind of trying to get God to intervene a little bit here or help him out. And so he basically pours out his heart to God. He does ask for some help too, doesn't he, as the leader of Israel? What does he ask for? We haven't read in verses 16 and following, but hopefully you've looked at it or read a little bit before. Notice in verse 14 he says, I'm not able to bear all these people alone because the burden is too heavy for me. And so he says in verse 15, if I have to bear all the burden of these people alone, He said, if I've been a faithful servant, I'd rather you just kill me now than to have to bear all this burden by myself. And so what does God do? Yeah, he appoints 70 people to help him bear the burden of the people, doesn't he? It was too much. Now again, we're talking about 2 to 4 million people here. We're not talking about 100 people that Moses had to try to lead, but 2 to 4 million people. Can you imagine one person being in charge of 2 to 4 million people? I mean, that'd be a pretty heavy burden, wouldn't it? And so God does allow these 70 elders to share some of the burden of this leadership. But Moses was discouraged, wasn't he? The complaining got to him as a leader. And that's a good lesson for us, If our church leaders have to listen to us gripe and complain all the time, you think that's discouraging to them personally? Well, if they're human, it is. I mean, Moses was discouraged. And so he had to try to bear this and figure it all out. And he took those problems that he had to God, and God helped him out. Question number 6. The question is, how does fatigue affect our attitudes? I think the children of Israel were probably tired. Again, they hadn't journeyed in a long time. They just journeyed for 3 days straight. So I'd say they're a little bit worn out or weary or fatigued. And generally speaking, when you get tired, what happens? I get grouchy. I mean, that's just the way that it is. It's kind of a natural human reaction. You're worn out. You don't want to be bothered. It seems like everything irritates you whenever you're run down. And so maybe we should expect a little bit out of that from the people and from Moses. Question number 7 is, what influence can complainers have on our lives? Yeah, so how did this complaining begin? Notice verse 4 there. Who started it? Yeah, it started with this mixed multitude, didn't it? It started with this idea that they started throwing out here. Man, this food's awful. We had so much better food down when we lived in Egypt. And then in verse 10, who's complaining? Everybody, right? It kind of spread from this small group, throughout the entire camp. And again, that to me, it indicates complaining. It started with this mixed multitude, but soon the whole camp had joined in. And so complaining is contagious, isn't it? I mean, it can have a negative effect upon us. It seems like when one person complains, the other person thinks, well, I need to complain too. If they have the right to gripe and vent, then I should have that same privilege too. And pretty soon the entire camp was engulfed in it. Now Moses, we mentioned Moses. He did maybe complain a little bit, but he was on the opposite side of the fence in that he wasn't complaining about the food. Again, he appreciated, he understood those things. So what do you think kept Moses from complaining like everybody else?
Very, very comfortable. He'd been a shepherd. He had the perspective of everything. Not to mention being close enough to God to appreciate what God was really doing.
Yeah, I think that's the key. I think in all this, Moses kind of kept things in their proper perspective, didn't he? He kind of saw the overall picture of things. And again, whenever we start griping and complaining, what we're doing is we're leaving out the big picture. We're just focusing on what we don't have and the discomforts, and we're not remembering all the good things and the blessings that have been poured out upon us. And so I think Moses kind of kept all those things in mind. And then when he did have a problem, what did he do? Took it to God, didn't he? He didn't stand around and gripe and complain about everything. He took it to God and gave it over to God. He says, nothing that I can do in this situation, so it's in your hands now. And so I think that probably had a profound effect upon the attitude of Moses too. We read a little bit about conversation that takes place between Moses and God in verses 16 through 25. We don't have time to read all that, but I do want to mention a couple of things. God tells Moses, he says, you go out tomorrow and you tell the people they're going to have meat. And he said, you tell them they're going to have meat not for one day, or not for 2 days, or not for a week, but for a whole month. They're going to have meat, and they're going to eat meat until they're sick of it. Until it's coming out their nose. They're going to eat so much. And notice Moses here in verse 21. Moses says, the people who I am among are 600,000 men on foot, yet you have said, I will give them meat that they may eat for a whole month. Shall flocks and herds be slaughtered for them to provide enough for them? Or shall all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them to provide enough for them? Think about Moses here. He's in this situation. The people are disgruntled. God says, you go tell these people they're going to have meat for a month. Now, again, how many people we talking about here? Yeah, 600,000 footmen, those were the soldiers, but 2 to 4 million people. Can you imagine how much meat it would take to feed 2 to 4 million people every day for a month? And that's a lot of meat, isn't it? And so Moses is thinking in his mind, I got to go out here and tell these people they're going to have a meat for a month. Where are we going to get all this meat? How are we going to provide meat for that big of a crowd for an entire month? And so he says, all right, what are we going to do? What am I going to tell them? Are we going to kill all the flocks and the herds that we have, that we brought with us out of Egypt? Are we going to, are you going to gather all the fish of the sea and give it to this multitude? And so Moses was obviously in a position where he didn't want to tell the people something and then have to go back on that. He didn't want to promise them something and then it wasn't going to be able to be delivered for them. But the giving of this meat, was it a reward for the complaining? Is that why God gave them meat? What would you call it? I would call it a judgment. God says, you want meat? Here's your punishment. You're going to get meat. And you're going to eat it for a whole month. And you're going to eat it until you're sick of it, until you don't want it anymore. And so it wasn't a reward for complaining, but it was a judgment or a punishment of God that he poured out upon them for that. So verses 26 through 35, I think all of us probably know the story. If you don't, you can scan it real quickly. But how does God provide meat for the Israelites? Yeah, quail, and specifically how? Yeah, so there's this great wind that God sends out, and this wind brings these quail all around the camp. And there's kind of debate. I forget what verse it looks like. Verse 31 there, at the end of the verse, says they were all around the camp about 2 cubits above the surface of the ground. And so that's 3 feet high. Now, people debate, does that mean the quail were 3 feet thick? Is that what it meant? Or could they only fly 3 feet high and then the wind would blow them back down, which would make it much easier for the people to gather? I don't know. I just know that there was plenty of quail to go around. And how did the people react to it?
Picked out, right?
Yeah. That's kind of an understatement, If you read in verse 32, it says, the people stayed up all that day, all night, and all the next day, and gathered the quail. And he who gathered least gathered 10 omers. So they stayed up the first day, they stayed up the entire day, they stayed up all the night, kept gathering quail, and they stayed up all the next day and were gathering quail. And does anybody have a figure in their Bible, a footnote or something on the 10 omers? Yeah, that doesn't bring us any closer. It is true, but
6 bushels or 220 liters.
yeah. So basically, you're looking at, depends on which kind of measurement it was, but you're looking at the guy who got the least gathered 60 gallons of quail. That tells you a little bit about how obsessed they were with the meat. And so, was God happy about that? No, that made God even madder, didn't it? Because here they are, and they're just being gluttons. You know, they're just pigging out. They're just, you know, as much meat as they can eat. And so, you know, God sent this wind. You know, it's nothing for God. I know sometimes we read about this and say, well, that seems like it's impossible. Yeah, he sent a wind and dried up the Red Sea too, didn't he? Held the waters of the Red Sea up. It's not impossible, you know, for God. He can do anything. He has the power. He has the knowledge to do it. And so he did what he promised he would do. Anybody have any thoughts or any comments there on chapter 11? All right, let's go over to chapter 12. We don't have a whole lot of time left, but again, it's a pretty familiar story. Somebody read verses 1 through 3 for us there in chapter 12.
And Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. They said, hath the Lord indeed spoken only by Moses, and he not spoken also by us? And the Lord heard it. And the man Moses was very meek above all the men which were upon the face of the earth.
Okay, so we read about a conflict here that takes place with Moses. And what does this conflict deal with? Question 10 here on your handout. What's it about? Yeah. Okay, is in-laws, I think Dennis said. But Miriam and Aaron take exception to Moses marrying this woman. Now, it seems like this is a recent marriage. Would you agree about that? I mean, I don't think it's the same woman that he married, you know, umpteen years ago, and they're just now starting to complain about it. I don't know the situation. I don't know if his wife dies at this point or what takes place, but we know that he marries an Ethiopian woman, and Miriam and Aaron took exception to it. They confront Moses about it. Now, I know to us, we read that and we think, well, that's no big deal, right? Moses is the leader of the children of Israel. But Miriam was a prophetess. We know that. She was publicly recognized among the children of Israel. Who was Aaron? What did he do? He was the high priest. And so you have some pretty powerful figures here within Israel launching a complaint against its leader. Was that the reason that they really started complaining, though? Is that what the fight was really all about? What was it about? Yeah, jealousy. What did somebody else say? Power. You know, Moses was the leader, and Miriam and Aaron weren't getting the credit that they thought that they deserved. And so they were looking for something, you know, that they could launch a complaint here against Moses about. But like it says there, Miriam, she's kind of the instigator, I think the ringleader really of the complaint against Moses. I say that because God ends up punishing her. It seems like she kind of comes out and does a lot of the complaining, but she was that prophetess. Aaron was the high priest, and it was really about this idea that Moses got to say in everything. You know, the people listened to him. Whatever they said, they did. Well, did the high priest, should he have a say in something? You know, should a prophetess, should people in Israel listen to what this prophetess has to say? And so it was a conflict that arose between them. Moses had a unique character, though, that's highly commended in the scripture. And what unique characteristic did Moses have that allowed him to deal with not just this conflict, but a lot of the conflicts that came up in his life? Yeah, humility or meekness, right? And so the way, this is the common theme in human history, and I know we talked a little bit about it on Sunday night with the church at Corinth, but how do people try to build themselves up? What's one way that they do that? Yeah, by tearing other people down, right? Is that a spiritual act? You know, build yourself up by tearing somebody else down? Is that the way? Do what?
It's a damnable act.
It is, yeah. And so basically they were trying to cast doubt on the character of Moses, and what they were using was this marriage to this Ethiopian eunuch. And the reason that they were doing it is they were trying to elevate themselves in the sight of the people, trying to get more recognition and power. So Moses was a very meek man, And how can that, let's jump down here to 19 while we're on that thought. How can humility help in handling conflict? What did Moses do whenever Miriam and Aaron come to him and accuse him?
Pray for them. Pray for the mercy upon them.
Yeah, he ends up ultimately, doesn't he, offering prayer on their behalf. But is there any recorded words of Moses there? What did he say?
He didn't do nothing.
He didn't say anything, did he? You know, he didn't, and that's one of the hard things about meekness, because it's the tendency when somebody attacks you, it's just kind of reactionary, you know, to launch an attack on them, isn't it? Or to go on the defensive. Moses didn't do that. You know, he didn't say anything. He didn't retaliate in any way, and he didn't jump up and try to defend himself or his character. And so, you know, that's not an ordinary human reaction. That's something that's learned, isn't it? Something that's developed, and Moses had an extraordinary trait like that. That tells you a little bit about his ego. You know, he didn't have one. You know, he didn't care what people said about him. He didn't feel like he had to defend himself, and just didn't react to the accusations that were launched against him. But the Lord does. The Lord does react. And how does he call Miriam and Aaron? What does verse 4 say?
Spake suddenly.
Suddenly. Can you imagine that? You know, here you are in the middle of an accusation or a fight, and suddenly God says, Miriam and Aaron, come to the tabernacle. You know, that reminds me of when I was a kid. And your mom and dad yelled at you suddenly, Clint, get down here, you know. You knew you were in trouble, didn't you? But that's the way that God speaks to them and calls them. And he explains to them, you know, I speak to prophets by visions, by dreams. That's not how I speak to Moses. I speak to him personally, directly. And so he says, why are you not afraid, you know, to bring an accusation against a person like that? You know, why are you not afraid to do what you've done? And ultimately, God punishes Miriam for that. What was that punishment? Yeah, he struck her with leprosy. Tells you a little bit about Moses' character. Again, Moses immediately prays for her, doesn't he? He doesn't want her to die. He doesn't want her to have to suffer this terrible disease. And so the Lord heals her, but he says, you got to observe the ceremonial law, and that is you're going to be unclean for 7 days. So you're going to have to be shamed and put outside the camp for 7 days. So what do we learn in all that? We learn a little bit about complaining. We learn a lot about how the Lord views it whenever we complain about things that happen in our life, maybe even about people too, especially as leaders. Anybody have any thoughts or comments or anything before we end?
Jesus handled the accusation the same way. I guess we learn how to deal with it when people are attacking us. We let Christ and Moses there. You don't have to attack them back.
Yeah, that's not an easy thing to do, though, is it? Takes a special person to do that.